Hello, hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I am Abe with MysticGenmara.com, a small town mystic from the middle of Idaho. And tonight, sorry, a little bit late, I was having some computer issues. Nothing major, just more of me issues, I should say. But tonight we're going to go back to Occult and Crochet. And the shawl that I've been working on, I was hoping to be further along with, but life has been driving me crazy lately, so we're not quite as far as I would like. I was able to get to the next color change, so we're now into this nice deep blood red over here. There we go. You can see it better. So we've kind of went from that light to that middle, and now finally getting to the ending part of it. We're almost done, but with any luck, if I don't have a bunch of other things happen, I should have that finished by next time, but we will have to see how that works out. But as far as the occult goes, we are going to introduce Doreen Valiente. Struggle with her last name for some reason. She is one of the first of Gerald Gardner's Coven, and she has more public, I should say, and she has a very long history with Wicca primarily, but there's some other modalities that get tossed in along the way. But it is her first love, which is Wicca, that we will kind of be focusing on primarily. I'm going to put a disclosure right now on this one. She is another one that had a very storied life. There was a lot of information about her. I've linked some stuff in the description, one of which is her own autobiography, which I read probably 20 years ago, and I have not picked it up since. So there's a lot of this is either from my memory or from rooting around on the internet, which is always fun. If you really want to get a much deeper dive, there are two books. One is her autobiography. The other one is a biography someone did of her. The part that I found a little bit frustrating was the biography that was done of her. I don't know if it's still in print. You can still find it, and it's not hyper expensive. It's like 20 bucks, 25 bucks, something like that. But as I was looking around, I couldn't figure out if it's still being published or if this is just like a sell-through thing. So there is that aspect of it. To be completely honest with you, and I'm going to start off before I even get into her history right now, saying if you really want to understand the core and roots of Wicca, start with Gerald Gardner. He was controversial at at best, but he did know and kind of founded what we would say today is modern day Wicca. The second person, if you find Gardner's work interesting, fascinating, you want to stay with that, the next one to go to would be the lady that we're about to speak of tonight. From her, I would move to Alex and Maxine Sanders and their assorted works. And then there's a couple of other people that I want to talk about down the road, but those ones are going to give you the best baseline for what modern day Wicca is. I did a video about it before, so you have that baseline if you kind of want to have a general idea. But if you want to get into the nuts and bolts, which I'm not going to probably do on here in that level because it is a personal experience, it is a personal religion, spirituality. So if you want to go down that rabbit hole, I highly recommend start with Gerald, move to Doreen, and then check out Alex and Maxine. That's A, timeline wise how it worked, but B, that's going to give you probably the broadest, roundest view of what actual, genuine, at its core Wicca is. Now, from there, there's books all over the place, and I encourage a true seeker to continue to search out beyond that. But one of the reasons that I started this channel, one of the reasons that I am very passionate about this type of work, is a lot of the people today pop up, start their stuff, write a book, but they don't know their foundation. They don't know why they have this belief. They don't know where it comes from. A lot of them will admit to how they got into the craft at some point. But I want to introduce you, I want to bring it back. Understand the foundations of spirituality, whether it's Wicca, the Golden Dawn, the different church groups that I have talked about so far, and have many, many more to go over in the future. My goal is to help you set a foundation for future study and research, and also help you understand, is this really where I want to be, judging by the foundational works? And sometimes that might not be the best option, but I want to give you, anyone who's watching, the option to make that decision, and I want to give you an idea of where these people start from. There are some of them I'm a little bit more passionate about than others. That's because of how they've influenced me in my life and on my journey. I try to leave a lot of that out when I'm just going over the person, or at least noting that this is my opinion. So that's kind of where I wanted to go with that. And I'm not sure why that felt so important to say at the start of this one, but it did. So onwards and upwards. Doreen Edith Domini Valiente, have fun with that name, is born in January of 1922, so quite a while ago, really. She came into the world on the outer edge of London in a little suburb that you might know from more modern comments, but it's in Surrey. She was born to Father Harry Domini, who is a civil engineer, and Mother Edith Domini. And from accounts that I have found, it appears that Edith, the mother, was a stay-at-home mom primarily. It doesn't stay that way that I found anyway, but in the beginning, stay-at-home mom. Harry, her father, was a Methodist by upbringing, but Mother Edith had some issues, and I could not find what it was that she was having a spat with the local vicar over, but because of said spat with vicar, mom was pretty much like, deuces, I'm not interested. So dad would go to church on occasion, but mom was straight up like, nope, we're not doing this. And because of that, and I thought this was just a really random thing to be emphasized in a couple of different places, Doreen was not baptized in the Methodist religion. And it's a weird side tangent that I've kept trying to dig out more. No. No information given. According to Doreen, there was not a real close relationship with either of her parents. And that may sound weird now, especially how things go later, but there really wasn't a lot of close bonding in the beginning, according to Doreen's view. She thought that her parents were significantly about social climbing than being actual parents. I get that. Totally understand. But is it really true? We'll see. She also would claim that they were highly conventional. And how is highly conventional not being a good parent? She would imply that they were conventional for appearances, and it was to help move up in society. Okay. Doreen moved around a lot, part of this society chasing thing. From her birth town in Surrey, the family would move to another part of Surrey when she was like 3 or 4, and this is where she would have her first spiritual experience, and it was while gazing at the moon. She got a deep connection with the moon, and if you've ever been privy to or been able to be involved in certain lunar rituals, it's amazing how powerful that satellite is, really. And from that point, she would stare at the moon, and it would stick with her, this aspect, the spiritual connection that she would feel. And it stayed with her, according to her and those around her, for the rest of her natural life. But this was not the end of Doreen's childhood movement. From the second home on the other side of Surrey, the family would move to West Country and eventually to a little suburb called New Forest. And it was here that, and I couldn't find an exact reason for the separation, but her parents were like, we're done. So they separated ways. Her mother would take Doreen and they would move to Southampton to live with Doreen's grandparents, which was Edith's parents. And if you could only imagine a leader in as a high priestess in the Wiccan community, Doreen was a very precocious child. Imagine that. And interesting to me is at a very young age, 5, 6, 7, once she learned how to read, you couldn't keep a book out of her hands, is how it was implied. It is guessed that she read in one of the towns that they were moving in a book on magic or spellcraft that was at the local library. I didn't have that at my library. Anyway, and it was said that she would cast her first spell by the age of 13, but it wasn't even for her. Her spell was to protect her mother from an annoying, possibly harassing coworker. And in Doreen's mind, this spell worked fabulously, and she was very confident for being someone so young in that world. But this early interest in magic and the occult would lead Doreen to a convent school. Imagine that. Her parents were concerned for her spiritual health and welfare, so they sent her away to be trained in a nunnery. But this would eventually kind of not be her thing in a big way, because at age 15 she took off from school and pretty much said, I'm never going back, and she never returned. And like, you made it 2 years, kid. That's longer than I think I could have survived something like that. When she got out of convent school, she wanted to study art. That was just not in the cards for her, unfortunately. But factory work was, and that's where she got her first job, was at a factory. From there, she would move into being a clerk and a typist at the unemployment office. There's another name for it, but I looked up what that term was. It was the unemployment office. And this coincides with a very important date. This is the beginning of World War II. So Doreen would work as a Foreign Office Civilian Temporary Senior Assistant Officer. I'm not exactly sure what that is. Even looking it up, I was like, it sounds kind of like a secretary, but not really, kind of, sort of. Big name, basic type job is what it looked like. And her primary purpose under that title, which I think was heavy enough, she was a translator. And why would you just not say she was a foreign translator? Foreign language translator. Way shorter. And it was at this time, whoops, my mouse is being really touchy today. It was at this time that Doreen would eventually meet her first long-term relationship. And by long-term, I mean like 2 years. In the town of Barry, she met Jonas, and I'm sorry, this name. He was a Greek merchant navy sailor type person. And it's Joannis Vlachopoulos. I said this name a few times with like one of the little online things. That's the closest I can get. We'll go with Joannis for now. And by the end of January of 1941, shortly after the war started, they were officially married. But this was going to be a very short marriage. In June, 6 months later of that same year, he was on a U-boat, doing his thing, doing a sailor thing, and the boat would be sunk. And he was classified as missing in action / presumed deceased. And I actually kind of feel sorry for her at this point, because she was only like 19, 20 at this time. And this was a huge loss really early in life. And in my personal opinion, especially going over as many of these people as I have, this tends to trigger a deep dive into spirituality, because you have to understand, why did this happen? So this is not a pivotal moment, but it is a big moment in her life. By 1942, She had been married and widowed. Doreen was working around Wales, not kind of feeling listless, is how it was implied. And it's said that she may have been doing intelligence work for the Allies during this time. Very secret spy, very much getting into that cooler aspect of what all she was doing. In October of 1943, and these are a lot of dates and kind of boring stuff, Doreen received a transfer to London from Wales, the Mayfair area to be more on the dot there. Intelligence offices is why she was transferred, leading a little bit more substance to the rumor of her doing intelligence work in 1942. Decryption was her primary interest. Decryption, if you ever want a really entertaining look at decryption, how to break codes, things like that, dive into the Enigma machine during World War II. That was a fascinating piece of equipment, a nightmarish piece of equipment, but fascinating nonetheless. So when you go with decryption as part of her job in London, big time secret spy stuff. Go Doreen, awesome start to her life. Some really miserable parts, but this was cool. But around 2 years after her first husband lost, so we're still in 1943, Doreen would meet a gentleman by the name of Casimiro Valiente. Valiente was from Spain, if you couldn't guess by his name. And I'm not going to go too much into him. He doesn't play too big of a role here, other than giving her last name. He was in the Spanish Republican Army, then he joined the French Foreign Legion, and from the Legion he would be injured and end up moving to England, and this is how he met Doreen. There's only this much more of him that I will talk about, because he's in most of the work around Doreen. He's not talked about a lot. He's mentioned, but it's kind of like in passing, like they moved here or they did this, but it's not a focus. And there's a reason for that. Shortly after meeting, Doreen and Casimiro would be married in May of 1944. The newly married couple would move to Bournemouth, and I'm sorry to anyone from Europe watching this, I'm horrible with some of the names over there. And she moved there to be closer with Doreen's mother. Casimiro would take up work as a chef, and I'm a little bit baffled as to where that came from. He worked in the Spanish Republican Army, he was in the French Foreign Legion. Unless he was a chef there too, kind of confused as to where the chef thing came from. And trust me, I love kitchen work. I've done it since I was 14. We won't talk about how many years ago that was. But he is one of the primary first people I've ever talked about who is directly connected to kitchen work. And so, I don't know, I just had to bring that up, sorry. Back to the official story here. In my opinion, Doreen never lost her interest in the occult and magic and spiritual experiences from her 5-year-old, 4, 5, 6-year-old brain when she had that connection to the moon. But according to all accounts after that, she rediscovered, like it's a new thing, the occult after moving back to Bournemouth. And it was here she would meet a friend that would go by the name of Zerky. Didn't find a lot about that. The name is in her autobiography, but I didn't find a lot of information outside of that. This friendship would eventually lead her into ceremonial magic. And I'm curious, but how this all lined up. She came into the possession of notebooks and tools of a recently deceased Alpha et Omega Lodge member. How? That was a very quiet, closed-off lodge, and you just happened to end up with all of this person's notebooks, tools, and ritual wear? Okay. And the Alpha et Omega is a branch off of the Golden Dawn, and I might do a bit more research into those guys later. They're still kind of sort of around, but they're not as big as they were back in the day. This interest in ceremonial magic, especially after receiving the tools and notebooks, would spark Doreen into trying to learn Hebrew. Side note, this is a challenge. The language is complex in its odd way of not having vowels. That's the first complexity. And a lot of ceremonial magic that flows out of the Kabbalistic practices use Hebrew as a key aspect of that magical source. So there's a lot of energy that goes with that language, but that is not an easy language to learn. And Kabbalistic Hebrew is a little bit different, not massively different, but a little bit different than the commonly spoken Yiddish. So there is a little bit of variance there. So good on her. That is an amazing thing to try. Doreen would at this time take the name of Ameth, which is her magical name during this time and kind of her magic name for the rest of her life. It was also during this time that she would come across a biography of Aleister Crowley. Yay! Oh. This would lead her into a text called Magic in Theory and Practice, which was by Crowley, and it's a kind of a guideline for ceremonial magic, the way he taught it. And where did she find this text? In her local library. I don't know how many local libraries just happen to have a text called Magic in Theory and Practice by Aleister Crowley just laying around for people to pick up. I've been to a lot of libraries and I've yet to find something like that just kicking it. So she had some awesome libraries that she was going to. Doreen was also looking into other forms of occult practices during this time, including spiritualism, the Fox Sisters, the knocking, the seances, that kind of spiritualism, including crystal balls, and theosophy as well. Well, there's that. She was doing really good until she ran across that. And I have an opinion on theosophy, and I will go into that when we discuss that person, because not impressed personally. But you can see she always has her little crystal ball there, which goes into the spiritualism part, and this is what she looked like around this time period. And this is about the time that she would really step into her Wiccan practice. And I don't know, she looks like she'd have been a lot of fun to hang out with just in general, but in spiritual terms, heck yes. Doreen would also read the works of witchcraft by authors such as Margaret Murray, which a lot of people don't like, and I do want to talk about her, basically dedicate some time to her because there's a lot there. And she believed that there had been, that Doreen did, I love it when it corrects what I write. I said what I said. A pre-Christian witch-based practice. And her views during this particular time period when she was reading Margaret Murray and some of the other authors at the time, this was around 1945, 1950-ish time period, she was of the opinion that, yeah, it existed, but it disappeared into the mists of time. It's not still around today. Just, it would be cool if it was, but it's just not. And as luck would have it, in 1952, she would discover that there actually was a real-life witch still practicing in the area at that time. And he was currently living on the Isle of Man, Mr. Gerald Gardner. Through a snail mail back and forth, which at that time could have taken a month or two to get the correspondence all transferred around here, she would, and I'm not saying that to be slow, they talked a lot, but she would eventually be put in direct contact with Gerald Gardner himself. That took some time to orchestrate all of that. Why is my phone going off? I put it on silent. Just 1 second. Okay. And Gardner would eventually want to meet Doreen, like, fascinated by this woman's intelligence, her brain, and the way she wrote and just talked about things, really. And so he would leave the Isle of Man and meet her at a fellow witch's house in Christchurch near Bournemouth, so it wouldn't be too far of a drive for her, or travel for her. This particular witch was Edith Woodford Grimes, whose coven name was Defo, something like that. Gardner was always testing people, and when I talked about with him before, he was always kind of pushing boundaries, seeing where you stood, if you were actually willing to be devoted to the craft or if your interest was superficial. So he tested Doreen by offering her a copy of High Magic's 8, which was his fictional quote-unquote novel about initiation in the Middle Ages, again, quote-unquote. Nudity, ritual scourging are prevalent through the book. Not so much the scourging, but the nudity part. Gardner wanted to see if Doreen would be open to initiation, or at least be even more curious after reading the book to see how deep she actually wanted to go into Gardenian. Well, at that time it was just called witchcraft, but he was wanting to see how far she was willing to delve into this. And obviously, since I'm talking about Doreen at this time, she liked the book a lot. And the following year, on Midsummer of 1953, which I'm sorry, would be a beautiful time to do this, she was initiated by Gerald Gardner at Edith's home. So they went to Edith's home, Gerald did the full initiation rites with her, and after this private initiation, the three of them would travel to Stonehenge to watch the Druids perform the Midsummer Ritual at Stonehenge. I am so jealous. I don't think anyone really understands how jealous I am of that. Gardner would loan a sword of his own to the Druids for the ritual. Sign me up. I want to go. Take me to your Midsummer Ritual. The next part kind of surprises me, though, here. Doreen, and what we know about Doreen now, this is the part that's a little bit weird to me. Doreen would share that she visited Stonehenge with her husband and her mother, but she never talked about the meeting with Gerald Gardner or the initiation at all. Like, he was a friend, and Edith, not Edith, what was her name? Yeah, Edith was another friend, and they were just social friends, like pen pals, and they just wanted to go to Stonehenge and hang out for a little bit. But you didn't talk about the initiation, who Gerald Gardner was, which maybe that was probably not a bad thing. She said that she didn't think that they would understand, and her husband probably never would have. Her mom might have. I'm not saying that she did, but the way her and her mother's interactions went over the years, it might have been a little bit less traumatic than expected. Might not, but that's just kind of my thoughts. Doreen would later travel to West London and meet the rest of the Bricket Wood Coven that Gardner had founded. Sorry. And after that introduction, she would rise within the ranks of the coven to become the High Priestess within that particular coven. And this is what brought Doreen into mainstream Wicca. Doreen was an avid reader of occult texts, literature, and basically scrolls, and discovered that much of Gardner's primary book of shadows was rewrites or copies of other people's rituals. And the one that concerned her the most was the fact that a lot of them were from Aleister Crowley's work. Not super shocking in reality that he had to fill in the blanks, and that happened a lot in that time period. Doreen confronted Gardner about all of Crowley's work being in his Book of Shadows, and he claimed he didn't have full rituals from his initiation and had to, how did they phrase that, fill in the blanks where necessary. So he was working from fragmentary work and filling it in to make it functional. And a lot of those sources included Aleister Crowley's work. And at that time, this was, mid-50s, Crowley's reputation was kind of fixed under the banner of the wickedest man alive And Doreen didn't want the beauty of Wicca, which is what she was practicing at that time, sullied by Crowley's antics. And I really need to dedicate some time to Crowley because I really want to bring him forward for everybody, because a lot of people's opinions of him are not exactly truthful or accurate. He was portrayed very specifically, and he laughed about it. He thought it was great. With Gardner's blessing, she would take his personal book of shadows, which this is how much he trusted her, and she removed the most obvious parts of Crowley's work. The subtle stuff would be left alone, but the obvious stuff was removed. In her mind, she was cleaning up the flow and magical purity of Wicca. Now, did that mean that she took everything out? No. And she replaced it with rituals that were a bit more proper for what she viewed Wicca. And from Gardner's own work, to me, she cleaned things up and made it smoother. There were some heavier parts of some of Gardner's stuff. And it was during this time of writing and cleaning up that Doreen would write her most famous rituals and poems. She wrote a lot of poetry in her life, but it was during this particular time period that she did some of her most well-known. One of which is Gerald Gardner. It's associated with Gerald Gardner's work, and that's The Witch's Rune. And her rewrite of his work, but she made it flow so much better, and that is The Charge of the Goddess. And her version of The Charge of the Goddess was thought to be her greatest single contribution to Wicca ever. That is saying a lot, to be honest with you. It is... Where did I put that one? I think it's this one. Move it over here. I have too many things open on my screen. That's cool. And I won't read the whole thing just because it is pretty long. I had this prepped, and then I moved two things, and that's all it took to mess up my screen. So, The Charge of the Goddess is... I'll read a little bit of it. I'm not going to do all of it because I'm not sure where the copyright is on it. But listen to the words of the ancient mother, who was of old called amongst men Astarte, Aphrodite, Cerodian, Maya, Diana, Terra, Ishtar, Hecate, Brigid, and many other names. Whenever ye have need of anything once in a month, and better when the moon is full, ye shall assemble in sacred space and adore the spirit of me, who is mother of all. Therefore ye shall assemble who desire to learn all sorcery, yet have not won its deepest secrets. To these I will teach things that are unknown, and you shall dance, sing, feast, make music, and love all in my praise. For mine is the ecstasy of spirit, and mine is the joy of earth. And my law is love unto all beings, keeping pure thine highest ideals. Strive ever towards them, let not stop thee or turn thee aside. For mine is the secret that opens the door of youth, and mine is the cauldron that gives the knowledge of rebirth. That's 2 verses. I'm not going to read all the rest of it. But that right there, and I will agree, and I've read a couple of variations of it, but her direct version of that is absolutely one of the best charges of the goddess I have ever seen. And when you read it, and you could probably hear some of the tone in my voice shifting because it brings almost a state of ecstasy to you as you're doing it, and not bad. Like, you feel uplifted, you feel enlivened, you get goosebumps and tingles. It's so much fun, and not just fun, it's spiritual. Like, it's like I said, they consider it to be one of the greatest single contributions to modern day Wicca. I say it's one of the greatest single contributions to spirituality. There are a few things, and I don't see them as they're Wiccan, they're ceremonial, they're religious. Nah. That particular Charge of the Goddess is, to me, one of the more important documents that's been written recently. towards spiritual connection. You can call it whatever you want. That's how I feel about it. And she has that poem and many others in the books that I linked in the description, so you can check those out. And I read it originally in I can't remember which book. I think it was, sorry. The first time I read it, I believe, was in Witchcraft for Tomorrow, and I'll talk about that book a little bit later. But it was, to me, a very inspiring book, and I was reading that one about the same time I was reading Gardner. I went through a big focus on Wicca and witchcraft when I first started on my journey. I needed to understand it, and then I came to understand it better. And it's some of the things that are being done today with it I'm not impressed with, but that's beside the point. In Doreen's now leadership role within the coven, she's now High Priestess. Get back to that. She would run the day-to-day aspects of the coven in London, and Gerald would spend the majority of his time back on the Isle of Man. And even when I talked about Gardner, there was these weird points where he would just step away from the coven altogether and just be alone, which I get, but that's kind of weird when it's, you're a coven. This separation between Doreen and Gardner by physical proximity was not a good thing, though. Gardner, during this time, was trying to take Wicca public. Get as much publicity as he could, good or bad. It did not matter to him. Get publicity for the coven, and Doreen thought that this was an absolutely horrible idea. She wasn't out to her husband. Her mom didn't know. There's a lot of things in her life where this could have been a disaster for her. And as I talked about with Gerald, there was a lot of things that could have been disastrous for a lot of people in that coven at that time. Doreen believed you were risking the security and safety of the coven members by being so vocal and open about things. And I kind of have to agree with her during that time period. Times changed, but during that time, 100% I'd have to agree. This would eventually lead to a fracturing of the coven and all associated groups. Doreen's side of the argument, which was the larger of the two factions, was like, well, you're not doing this public thing. Gerald and his smaller public side were very much about that. So there was a little bit of a rift that went on here. And she decided, you know what, let's try to mend some rules. Except for this was kind of a shady way, and they both did it to each other. She offered a set of rules for the craft, which set in place some limits on public attention for the craft and the coven. And he would respond to her with his Wiccan laws and try to restrict her position as a high priestess. And this led to the group officially splitting in 1957. And I like the fact that through all of this, she never turned on the craft as Gardner had designed it. She got frustrated with him as a person and kind of the power play he was doing. But even though she didn't like the way he was going about spreading the word, she was not turning against what it was that was being proposed. As far as the craft itself, she just didn't like being so public about it. But from here, Doreen would go on to found her own coven. Due to internal power struggles, this did not last long, unfortunately. So Doreen decided she wanted a new start, be done with all of the drama, move away. So she took her family and her mother to the coastal town of Brighton. And this was around 1956, so it was just before the big fracture that would occur. Just things were getting heavy. She wanted to move away to get some distance from it. I get that. And from there, they would move around the Brighton area multiple times. And it's not specifically said if it was a financial reason or just they wanted different neighbors. But it was in the town of Brighton that Doreen would meet Leslie Roberts, who was a journalist who shared Doreen's love of the occult and supernatural. And Leslie had made kind of a name for himself, exposing darker aspects of magic and occult, but he was trying to bring to light and show that that's one side, there's another. So he was really trying to bring in the light, bring in the positivity, and Leslie and Doreen would remain friends until the end of his days. She would help coach him into, what's the positive parts of, the occult were, not really going public herself at this time, but she did help encourage and support him in his endeavors. And over the course of her work with Leslie, she did start to mend her fences with Gerald, and they eventually mended the friendship, and they kind of mended the covens as well. And from that point, they remained friends and spiritual partners and spiritual practitioners together until his passing in 1964. There's a little thing here that I want to do some way back on, just because I jumped ahead and I was doing this, and I'm like, actually, I want to keep the flow, so we're just going to hop back a couple years. Doreen's mother had passed away in 1962, and it was at this time that Doreen actually decided on her own to be very public about her Wiccan practices. She felt better about going out to the press and talking about the beauty and amazing gift that the craft offered. First by letter in around 1962 to a magazine called The Psychic News, and later to the Evening Argus, which I'm not exactly sure what that was, because I wrote it down, was going to double check it, and then got distracted by other things, shiny object mind here. But she would contact Evening Argus in 1964. This led her to writing multiple letters and articles for a variety of papers, and this is where she started making television appearances. This is where she really started being okay with being out in public. And Doreen would even take, and I thought this was interesting just considering her personality during this, leading up to this, she would take the title of president of the Witchcraft Research Association after Sybil Leek had resigned. That was pretty public. That group was very outspoken, and for her to step up and be like, I will take the second presidency of this research, that's huge for her. It was during this time, and I say that a lot, need to find a new term, that she published her first book, which was called Where Witchcraft Lives. This would hit the shelves around 1962, and she wasn't quite ready to fully step into the light, so she wrote this as a scholar and researcher of the craft. Yeah. This book is still a great foundational book, and I did put it down in the description. It's, like I said, a lot of her work I read many years ago, so I have my memory is a little bit faded on some of it. As more public awareness came to Wicca, Doreen would correspond with various other traditions, various other practitioners of witchcraft and other groups. None of them really caught her fancy. I do want to show you this, though. Is this the one I'm after? I think so. Yes. This is Doreen Virtue and Patricia Crowther around this time period. It was in the 60s, I believe, is when this photo was taken. And this is some of the time when she was trying to get out and see a bit more, be a bit more public about things. And I just thought that this was kind of a fun picture, because when you look at Doreen's face in that picture, she's got this mischievous little cheeky smile. And of course, Patricia was Patricia. So you can see that these two probably were actually a lot more friends privately than publicly ever. But this was also during this time period of all this shifting around that was going on. She did finally come across a coven, because she was trying to find a new spiritual home while she was roaming around, called the Coven of Atho, and she would be initiated into that coven by a man named Raymond Howard, and it was from there that she would help source rituals for the coven, because they had a lot of rituals and they had a lot of work, but due to people not being honest as to where they would get their information, Raymond in particular had no idea where this stuff came from. They just knew that they'd practiced it, they didn't know. And so they would, as she was initiated into the coven, she started helping them sort where a lot of their stuff was, because she had read that much source occult and spiritual work at that time that she could actually help them figure out where all this came from. And it was from there that Doreen would meet another person and become a member of his coven for a very short time. Robert Cochrane found a coven called the Clan of Tubal Cain. And I want to go over him. I'm going to be very careful about how I go over him, because his life is, to put it mildly, was not the greatest. But he was also kind of a shyster, a little bit of a swindler. Let's just say it didn't take very long for Doreen to become extremely disenchanted with Robert and would call him out for not being respectful, because Robert popped up out of nowhere, kind of made his own thing. Very not respectful to Gerald Gardner and those who had helped found things leading to this guy being able to do what he did. She eventually would wash her hands of his coven and the man himself, and even after he passed, shows Doreen's character as a person. She didn't like him. She did not like how his coven ran. She thought there were some big issues there. But she kept in contact with his widow after he passed. And she also kept in contact with other members of the coven, offering guidance and some support on rituals and just in general, which is pretty cool. But you detested him that much. But she didn't want to give up on the members, which I thought was pretty cool. And it's now time to bring in someone else that I ever talked about, and I already showed the picture, so I won't bring it up again. But it was just around this time period that Doreen eventually would meet Patricia Crowther and her husband. They would start to really become fast friends at this time. What's interesting is you don't hear a lot about them together after kind of an initial greeting, but there's enough cross-references in time frames to know that they actually stayed friends for a while. And in 1971, Doreen would make her first appearance, from what I could find, on a BBC television show, kind of a documentary almost, called The Power of the Witch. And I looked for this. There are some clips on YouTube, but I'm not sure who's in charge of said clips, so we won't go there just yet. And this particular documentary-ish show also featured the King of the Witches, Alex Sanders, who, again, we've already talked about, Alexandrian witchcraft's founder. That same year, writing the publicity, she would found a group called Pagan Front, which helped bring religious rights to witches and pagans, because up until this point, you could still be arrested for being a Wiccan or a witch in certain parts of Britain. This group wanted to have equal rights with the other mainstream churches, tax exemption, things like that, the authorization to perform weddings and funerals, baby devotions and all that stuff. They also wanted to be able to actually be public about what they were doing and not be so, shoved in the closet, keep the door closed with the broomsticks in it, And the beliefs of this pagan front, which is what the group was called, fell under three primary aspects: adherence to the Wiccan Rede, which we talked about and I went through line by line in my talk on Wicca, a belief in reincarnation, which I thought was an interesting aspect. This was foundational for their group, and then a sense of kinship with nature, which I espouse and have espoused for years, that we need to not so much turn our backs on industrialism and modern day technology. Obviously I'm on here, but we need to get back in touch with the seasonal shifts, the changes, your diets, all of that stuff. If we really start tapping in, has a seasonal aspect to it, and that is something you can't feel unless you're actually in nature. So like I said, I can't argue with that. The next year, in 1972, Doreen's husband, Casimiro, would pass from this world. And I haven't talked about him much, mainly because he didn't share his wife's obsession or interest in witchcraft or the occult. And according to Doreen, she said that theirs was an unhappy relationship. And I'm not going too far off topic on this one. I just want to bring this up for those who are in relationships or looking to be in relationships. And this is a core that came back from, my more Christian upbringing as a child, but it fits here. And it's important to remember this because of when you look at these people's lives. Be ye not unequally yoked, which in more modern terms, find people who share your values before you get into relationships. Because if you jump into a relationship and let's say you are a devout Wiccan in pick your line, and your partner, the person that you're starting to fall in love with, that you're, considering having a household, setting up shop with, type of a thing, is devout Catholic, devout Mormon, devout Jewish, you're not going to have the most peaceful household because you are going to be at odds in a lot of ways with their beliefs. That's something that you can pick up from going through a whole list of these people, is if you're not on the same page. And even when I talked about some of the Christian founders back in the start of this series, there are several of them who married someone outside of the religion that they were practicing or that they were developing, and it did not go well. Other ones that went pretty good, but a lot of them didn't. And that's a very important thing to be brought forward if you are interested. Even though Doreen said she wasn't close to her husband, her death did bother her to a certain extent, because after he died, she kind of let her house fall into disrepair. So much so that the city actually would condemn her home and move her into a council flat because her house was falling apart. People who would visit Doreen would say her house was consistently and constantly cramped with books. Some would say as many as thousands of books littered her house. And I feel slightly personally attacked by this because I don't have a piece of anything in my house that doesn't have a book near it or on it. So I feel a little attacked by that. This move actually into the council flats would be a good one for Doreen in the aspect of relationships. She would meet a member of the residence block committee, kind of like your HOA committee, named Ronald Cook. And it's just mentioned that they entered a relationship. I don't know if it was ever a marriage thing or it was just like long-term dating. But this would lead to him being initiated into Wicca under her tutelage. Unlike a lot of the people that I've talked about so far, Doreen, and I think it goes back to her secret spy days, was an exceptionally patriotic person. And I'm not going into too much politics here, just bringing this up because it was kind of fascinating to think about. She was involved heavily in the 70s in more right-wing political groups. And before anyone's feathers go sideways, the British version of right and left are far different from how they are seen in the United States or even in Canada for that matter. For example, she was very critical of one of the groups that she was associated with because that group didn't want women's liberation. Okay. They didn't want gay rights. Again, head scratcher there. And this particular group wanted to ban all forms of sex education. All forms. Where it's like, okay, there are some things you shouldn't teach children, but they kind of need to know how things work so you don't end up in weird situations. And there's also a theory, a little conspiracy theory going on with this, and this is a more modern conspiracy, by the way, that she joined these groups for one purpose, and that was to infiltrate, get intelligence, and ship it back to the intelligence agencies in Britain. I love the whole secret spy thing, so that's kind of a fun alternative to what was going on. And even if she was involved in some of that stuff, her primary focus was religious liberty for everybody, including the Wiccans and the pagans, women's lib, right to vote, things like that, which women's taxation, sorry, but that comes with it. Gay rights, just being able to not be, slammed in a closet, and sex ed. A lot of the times prior to a lot of these people's movements, people didn't have a clue officially, because the church had dumbed everyone down, what all went on in that process. There needs to be some education, not too far with that, just basics. This is what your body is, this is what it does, this is how babies are made. You don't really need to go into much more than that. They'll figure it out, trust me. But Doreen was a very busy woman with all of this going on. She studied the ley lines during the political stuff. She was studying ley lines, wrote reviews of research about them, including some reviews of several books. And as she researched the ley lines, she also came to the conclusion that we are entering officially the age of Aquarius. This was in the 70s. And this aligned a lot with her political views as well, so you've got this weird crossover going on. And it could have been all because of everything that was going on. There's a lot of movement occurring in her life in the 70s. One of the first books of correspondences, things you would use in rituals, magic, stones, crystals, herbs, all that lore, was actually written by Doreen Valiente. Not Virtue, good lord, not that one. Valiente. This was called the book's title, good grief, was Natural Magic. And she also wrote another one, and I talked about this a little bit earlier as like one of the books that I read years ago, called Witchcraft for Tomorrow. And in that, she talks about how the individual can actually perform self-initiation rituals to connect you into the divine, really get your foot started on the path. She even goes through a basic outline of how to develop and start a coven if you choose. And she sets these things up with kind of strict parameters, but it's because she wanted people to actually understand what Wicca was. It's not just whatever you feel, love, light, and butterflies and fairy farts. There's actually a practice that goes with it, and that's what she was trying to portray with this work. And it's amazing. Like I said, start with Gerald Gardner and Doreen Valiente and move on from there. Doreen would meet and eventually become friends with Janet and Stuart Farrar, and the three of them would publish a complete book of shadows from Gerald Gardner's personal work, thus attempting to clear up the misinformation postulated by people who were trying to demonize Gerald's original work or were purposely twisting it for their own needs and abuses. And thanks to all of their hard work, we have a better picture of what his original ideas were of the craft. These works are no longer an active publication that I could find. The titles are The 8 Sabbats for Witches and The Witch's Way. Now, when you punch in The Witch's Way, be prepared. There is an entire kids series. There are a stack of romance novels. You really have to make sure that you put in Stuart Farrar as the author, or you'll get buried under stuff that absolutely has nothing to do with what you're looking for. Doreen would write her own autobiography called The Rebirth of Witchcraft, which is a fascinating book. Highly recommend it. It's been a few years since I read it, but it's worth the read. And she anchored her place in modern Wicca with this work. She would not dismiss any of the claims that Gardner and all of the associates made, that they'd made up modern Wicca. She was very open about how Wicca was needed in the modern world. So regardless of origins, and this is how she viewed it, it is something that we need. Doesn't matter if Gardner made it up, doesn't matter if Margaret Murray was wrong. We need what Wicca is. And this was how she felt. And this was originally published in 1989. So think about that. In 1989, she felt that the world needed Wicca, a nature-based religion focusing on the balance of the masculine and feminine through the Lord and Lady, the God and the Goddess. And in all honesty, personal opinion here, I feel she is right, even up into this day in 2024. There's some things that need to be brought back. There's some things that need to be reconnected with. We have lost a big connection to our spirituality, and it's getting... There's aspects that people are reconnecting, but there's so much that has been lost, and that's the part where I feel that she's 100% right in her view that we need this type of stuff. Doreen would continue to inspire and influence the modern Wicca movement. She would meet and communicate with various big names within the Wiccan community, including one of my favorites, which is Starhawk. This would eventually lead to her finding a group called the Center for Pagan Studies. She found this group in 1997. And it was here that she met the founders of the group, which was John and Julie Bellum Payne. I hate hyphened names. And from that first meeting, they would eventually become fast friends. She was considered a patron of the group and gave many lectures over the remainder of her life. Mind you, she met and connected with John and Julie in 1997. Later that year, in 1997, Doreen would experience one of her last big disappointments. Her partner, the guy from the HOA, basically, Ronald Cook, passed from this world that year. This particular passing was probably the most tragic for her. This was a blow to her peace. This was a blow to her happiness, the happiness that she had experienced in her life. Doreen would make one final appearance in November of 1997. In this lecture, she praised quite a few people, but one in particular that stuck out was Dion Fortune for her contributions to modern occultism. And we'll talk about Dion later, but she did a lot of really big work back in the day on ceremonial magic, primarily. She would also encourage the Wiccan family as a whole, because even though she'd done so much work back in the 70s getting rights for everybody, Wicca I hope we are back. Been doing okay, so in theory we're back. Let me make sure of that, because that's the last thing I want to try to do is continue doing the stream, and it's not actually active. So just one second. And Odyssey may have dropped, because Odyssey does that when there's a hiccup in the stream. Okay, YouTube is still going. Let me see if Odyssey is... I think Odyssey dropped. Crap. Okay. Anyway, we'll just finish this up real quick. That's frustrating. Anywho, it's the last few minutes of the stream, so that's fine. After this last appearance in November of 1997, Doreen's health would actually fall apart. And I think it's partly her heart broke so bad that her body couldn't keep up. She was diagnosed with diabetes. She developed a terminal form of cancer, and she slowly became more and more immobile over the years. Her life would go slowly fade until she passed out of this world into Summerland in September of 1999. The Center for Pagan Studies held an all-night vigil after her passing. Her coffin and her body were cremated after the final rituals were performed, and her ashes were scattered into the woods of Sussex as she requested. After her passing, all of her works and tools were passed to John Bellamy Payne. John would also make sure to publish almost all of her poems after her passing in 2 different sets, one in 2010 and one in 2014, I believe. Doreen is remembered as a tall and beautiful woman. Some would say handsome, which is funny. Aquiline looks with very dark hair in her younger years. Strong, pragmatic, with several candid takes. She was independent, but would rather remain behind the scenes doing what she does to support the cause that she loved so much, the path of the wise one, the path of the Wiccan, while Alex and Maxine were the king and queens of the witches. For many, Doreen was seen as the mother of modern Wicca, or the mother of all witches. Her rituals and her poems are still in use today, considered some of the most influential works ever written for Wicca. And this little tidbit is just kind of fun. It is said that Doreen hated unexpected visitors. I have so much in common with this woman. It is said that she would refuse to open the door if people just dropped by. You show up, you're staying outside. And that is exactly how she felt, and I 100% relate with this. With her patriotism, she had an obsessive love of football. For those of us in the United States, we'd call it soccer. But to the point where if the games were on, especially the World Cup, she wouldn't answer her door, she wouldn't answer the phone. You'd better be lucky if you were in the house if she spoke to you. She loved that type of stuff. And she also had a little bit of a side thing going with horse racing. She liked that too. Not on the same level as the other, but she did enjoy it. So, with that, if you are new here, hit that subscribe button, drop a like on the video if you enjoyed this stream. Sorry about the glitch. I'm really not sure if it was Streamlabs, if it was my computer. Internet's been really sketched the last few days, so I apologize for that. And comment down below if you've ever read anything by Doreen, if she's kind of new to you. But Doreen Valiente was one of the biggest, most influential people that is kind of hidden behind the scenes for the most part in the Wiccan movement. So just something to think about. With that, I will let you guys go. Have a great rest of your evening, and I will see you in the next video.